Hi ladies, this is the last video that I'll be making for class, and obviously this is the last week of class. So you do have a homework assignment this week, a reading task, and you also obviously have to take the midterm, or I mean the final exam, and so please take that as soon as you can, but of course by Friday. And also, if there is late work that you submitted but you haven't seen an updated grade for, please let me know. Email me about that so I can make sure I went back and added in those grades or graded the stuff that you turned in late. So this week you're also going to read the rest of the book, and so there's several different topics. I'm just going to give a little brief overview. This will probably be even shorter than I've done in the past, because as you read it, you'll see these topics kind of fleshed out. But in the first chapter, you're first going to read about sort of the evolution of the missionary groups that came to the U.S. The first groups were Spanish missionaries. They primarily were in the southern part of the U.S., in places like California, Florida. And you will see, if you travel to any of those places, like California, for example, and you'll see several different towns like San Clemente or San Diego. And basically, each of those towns had a different sort of mission. And so they were all a day's walk from each other so that the missionaries could travel across those states and that part of the country. Then the next group were the French missionaries, who were more in the north and east. And then finally, the English missionaries, when the English colonists came over. And again, these missionaries kind of followed the explorers. And when they were in these different communities, they different groups treated the people differently, but in some cases it wasn't very good treatment. In some cases they really did kind of make the indigenous people take on the Christian faith and were a little forceful in that. That wasn't always true, but certainly we can find that in our history. Also, as America started to become its own country, there were all sorts of people who came to America, and what you see from a religious point of view is that a lot of these people were sort of on the fringes of society, different religious beliefs that weren't being accepted within, England itself, so they came to the new colonies because they wanted to practice their faith more freely. And so this kind of led to what were known as the Great Awakenings. There were two of them, and basically people became, as people were settling and becoming more focused on the land and their possessions and the country itself, they started to become a little bit more lackadaisical about their faith and religion. And so these traveling preachers would travel around and hold revivals. And in these revivals, they were very enthusiastically sharing their beliefs and really kind of condemning people who disagreed with them. And this probably is, one of the reasons anyway that the framers of the Constitution were so determined to make sure that there was religious freedom, because they didn't want people condemning their own beliefs. At this time, there were all sorts of different denominations that popped up too. A denomination is a specific form of Christianity. So there's all sorts of denominations of Christianity, Catholicism being one of them. And this means that they are believers in Jesus, followers of Jesus, but hold a kind of unique set of beliefs. And there's all sorts of kind of nuances to these beliefs. And you'll read about all sorts of different denominations and their founders, and you'll see that some of them are much more in tune with the Holy Spirit, or maybe more focused on the end times, or maybe more scripturally based, maybe reading the Bible very literally versus more contextually. And so people kind of start grouping up in smaller groups with people that agree with them, and that's why there's so many denominations of Christianity today. Some issues that all the different religions had to kind of deal with were the issues of slavery, women's rights, and workers' rights. And so you'll see how that kind of plays out in chapter 24. One huge thing that happened in the history of the Catholic Church anyway is something called Vatican II. This was a council that was called by Pope John the 23rd. Pope John the 23rd was kind of elected to be sort of an interim pope. He was older and they didn't expect him to live very long. And so they thought he would just keep the status quo. But he surprised everyone when he called for Vatican II. So Vatican II started around 1963. Pope John the 23rd actually died while Vatican II was happening, and so Pope Paul VI was the Pope at the end of Vatican II. And there were lots of changes that came out of Vatican II. Most of the most obvious ones were liturgical changes. Prior to Vatican II, a priest would have faced the back altar with his back to the people. He would have spoken in Latin. There would have been an altar rail that separated the people from the altar. Most people were more like observers, and they weren't real involved. They just watched everything that was happening on the altar. A lot of people didn't receive communion often. They had to receive it once a year, but not super often. So at Vatican II, they changed a lot of this. The Mass was said in the language of the people. The priest turned and faced the people. There were things added to sort of get people more involved, like some of the music was more upbeat. They added in the prayers of the faithful so that people would know about specific things happening in their community. They did the sign of peace. So there were a lot of liturgical things that were kind of aimed at getting people more involved. So that was one of the big calls of Vatican II, is to have people fully actively participating and try to take like lay people and help them to see that they were called to holiness just like any priest or bishop. Some of the other things that came out of Vatican II, one thing was the ecumenical movement. This was more like a movement that still exists in our church, where the attempt was being made to try to focus on what these different denominations had in common instead of what separated them, and to try to find some common ground. A really cool thing actually is happening in Omaha right now that would be an example of the ecumenical movement. It's called the Tri-Faith Initiative. It's happening on 120th and Pacific Street, and there is a Jewish synagogue, an Islamic mosque, and a Christian church that are all being built on the same ground. And in the middle of those, they're building a communal building that's called Abraham's Tent. And this is an opportunity for these different religions to try to open up dialogue with each other. Specifically, the ecumenical movement was more like a Christian movement, but it was aimed at trying to open up dialogue so that a lot of the differences could be kind of minimized, whereas the commonalities could be really, highlighted. Also, between science and theology, there started to be more common ground there too, where people started to say, okay, the Bible isn't factual when it comes to science, but it is factual when it comes to whatever God wants us to know about God. And so even if, the earth wasn't created in 7 days, God is behind however it's created. So seeing kind of God as the master behind all of science, but yet trying to listen to the facts and information that science can help us understand. A really important thing was Catholic social teaching. This started, I mentioned this last week, with a document, an encyclical called Rerum Novarum, which was on the condition of the workers. And in these papal documents written by the Pope, it started to address a lot of current issues and some of the injustices in society. So you're going to read about 7 themes of Catholic social teaching and try to apply one of those themes to a common current event. Liberation theology is just basically trying to go back to the Bible and what has been revealed in history, try to help use that information to free people. A specific group that has gained some attention are women. So feminism is a movement that happened outside of the church but impacted the church and is still impacting the church, and the church has a ways to go where it comes to women's rights, but it had an effect. Black theology, there started to be a clear indicator that African American people experience God a little bit different, and their theology kind of spoke to those differences and gave them an area for their expression of faith. In chapter 25, it goes into much more detail about sort of interreligious dialogue and sort of a history of that. And so I'm having you read one of the encyclicals from Vatican II that's called Nostra Aetate. And this is a document that's talking about our relationship with other religions. And it's interesting because it suggests that we should study other religions because we can find some religious truth in those other religions. It's not saying that everything that they say is true, but that there is religious truth, and we can find it by being in dialogue with those people and also studying their religion as well. So before I end the video, I just want to thank you all for a great summer semester. I hope you learned a lot about the evolution of the church. I hope you understand that in the history of the church, you're also a very important person in that history. And you also, like many of the people you read about, have a call to kind of help spread this good news and help people understand Jesus, or at least the message of Jesus of love for neighbor and love for self. And all of that can really help advance the world and help us as a world find more peace. So I hope you take to heart some of what you read and are inspired by some of the stories of some of the people. Hope you also understand from what you read that the church is a human institution, not always right, but always striving for what is right. Nothing but good intentions, but because it's a human institution, in the history of the church kind of stumbled along the way sometimes. I hope you in that see yourself and understand that, we are all sinners trying to be better people. And I love this saying that all saints were one day sinners and all sinners can one day be saints. And that kind of inspires me as just the stories of many of the people that we talked about and that you read about. So God bless you all and good luck to all of you, and have a great rest of your summer. I hope you have time for a little rest and relaxation. Thank you.